Hey guys! Today I'll show you a science fiction thriller TV series named Earth Abides. Spoilers ahead. Watch out and take care. The drama begins with Ish, a geologist who chose to live deep in the mountains far from the city for the sake of his work. One day, while collecting mineral samples at a quarry, he felt a sudden sharp pain in his palm. It turned out he had been bitten by a venomous snake. Cursing in frustration, Ish tried calling for help, but his phone slipped and fell into a crevice. With no other options, he resorted to self-aid. Using a knife, he cut into the wound and tried sucking out the venom. Though it slowed the poison's effects, it was far from a cure. Gritting his teeth through the pain, Ish made it home, chugged a few bottles of water, and collapsed onto his bed. His heart raced, his vision blurred, and an overwhelming drowsiness took hold. Before he knew it, Ish had drifted into unconsciousness. At some point during the night, Ish thought he heard someone knocking at his door. He remained motionless in bed as two people outside, shining flashlights, eventually walked away. Ish continued to sleep, oblivious to the passage of time. Helicopters occasionally buzzed overhead, and when thirsty, he instinctively drank water until only one bottle remained. Summoning all his strength, Ish dragged himself off the bed and finished the last drop. By the next morning, Ish awoke to find the snakebite on his hand completely healed, but he was not sure how long he had been out. After washing up quickly, he decided to head to the city for supplies. His car, parked outside, was covered in a thick layer of dust. Wiping the windshield clean, he inserted the key and, to his relief, the car started. The supermarket wasn't far, and after a short drive, Ish reached the city's outskirts. But something felt off. There were no moving cars, no pedestrians, not even the faintest sign of life. Parking near the supermarket, Ish was greeted by the sight of a decomposing corpse with military vehicles overturned in the plaza. Staring in disbelief, Ish noticed a flashing electronic sign telling people to find shelter in place, since it's a pandemic outbreak. He was stunned by the notice, rushing back to his car and flipping on the radio. Every channel echoed the same government warnings, emphasizing the virus's extreme contagiousness and lethality. Ish wasted no time driving to his parents' house. Entering the quiet home, he instinctively called out for his mom, but there was no answer. The dining table was still set with half-eaten meals, a chilling sign of how quickly everything had fallen apart. With a heavy heart, Ish opened the bedroom door, where the stench of death overwhelmed him. His father lay lifeless on the bed, and his mother's body was sprawled in the bathroom. Tears welled up in Ish's eyes. He couldn't believe it. One night of sleep had taken everything from him. His parents were gone, and the world was now an unrecognizable nightmare. Fighting through his grief, Ish dug a grave in the backyard, burying his parents to at least grant them some semblance of peace. Just this simple act of respect already set them apart from the countless others who had no such luck. That night, Ish lay in his childhood bed, bidding farewell to the life he once knew. The next morning, Ish set out in search of other survivors. But everywhere he went, the streets were filled only with corpses, not a single living person in sight. Walking along the desolate roads, Ish realized that even 20 years from now, the overgrown weeds would tower higher than a man. Gathering some supplies from the supermarket, Ish decided to head farther out. However, the city's exit bridge was completely barricaded. Frustrated, Ish got out of his car to inspect the roadblock, only to find it immovable. His composure finally broke. He slammed his fists against the steering wheel, hoping desperately that the last 2 days had been nothing but a bad dream. After venting his anger, Ish decided to try a different route. Flooring the gas pedal on the deserted highway, he sped along without a care, knowing no one would be around to issue him a ticket. As night fell, a faint red glow appeared on the horizon. After about 10 minutes, Ish finally reached another city. The streets were lined with dazzling, colorful lights. At first glance, everything seemed normal, except there wasn't a single person in sight. Ish entered the largest shopping mall, thinking if there were any survivors, this would be the place they'd gather. After all, the mall had everything: food, clothes, and entertainment. But after exploring every floor, he found no one. He wondered if he truly was the last person alive in the world. Ish went to the rooftop and took a bath in the open-air spa. Afterward, without even grabbing a towel, he dashed to the bar to look for a drink. Just as he picked up a glass, a woman's voice startled him from a nearby booth. Overwhelmed with excitement, Ish fumbled and dropped the glass. After 2.5 days of desperate searching, Ish had finally found 2 other survivors. He was full of questions, and after talking to them, he learned that they were business travelers from out of town. They had been staying at a hotel when the virus outbreak occurred. Doing the math, Ish realized that it had been 3 weeks since he was bitten. The male survivor, Milton, pulled out his phone, where he had documented everything that had happened. The CDC had initially issued a Level 1 alert. This virus was unlike anything seen before, highly contagious and fatal, rendering all antiviral treatments useless. At first, the authorities tried to cover up the truth, but things quickly spiraled out of control, and even government operations ceased entirely. The female survivor, Anne, firmly believed that the virus had spread across the entire globe, effectively wiping out humanity. She theorized that the three of them were among the rare, naturally immune individuals. Ish found it hard to accept this grim reality, since there were two men with only one woman left in this world. So he decided to search elsewhere for other survivors, believing that the world couldn't just end like that, and he couldn't survive without a woman for himself. As he waited for the elevator, Ish leaned weakly against the wall, his mind racing. Deep down, he had already started to believe Anne and Milton's claims. That night, he slept on the spot, and the next morning, he resolved to have another conversation with the two. However, after circling the area, he couldn't find them anywhere. Fortunately, he soon spotted Anne in the high-end fashion section, and Milton was nearby preparing breakfast. Milton speculated that the catastrophe might be the Earth's way of self-cleaning, as humanity had left too heavy an imprint. Anne, whose closest family members had all succumbed to the virus, nodded in agreement. Like Anne, Milton had also lost everything he cared about, which was why the two had banded together for mutual comfort. Now that Ish had joined them, Milton suggested they celebrate their small group's existence. But Ish voiced his own thoughts. He didn't plan to stay in this place forever. The world was vast, and he wanted to find more hope, especially another woman. Disheartened, Anne turned and walked away, while Milton tried to persuade Ish to reconsider. Milton argued that this place had all the supplies they needed, but Ish replied that it would run out eventually. Milton then revealed that he and Anne had made a pact. Once the supplies were gone, they would end their lives together. Still, Ish refused to be confined to one spot. Milton's gaze dimmed. He said when people lost the only thing they cared about, staying alive didn't feel better than dying. Ish, realizing he couldn't change Milton's mind, turned to Anne instead and offered to take her sexy body with him, possibly because she smelled good to him. To his surprise, Anne shared Milton's view. She explained that when she watched her two children die, her spirit had died with them. She had no hope left for this world. Ish, frustrated, shoved Anne aside and stormed out of the mall. 2 gunshots rang out behind him. Anne and Milton had ended their lives. Ish felt as if a heavy stone was crushing his chest. He slammed on the gas pedal, letting the car speed wildly down the road. But not all hope was lost. In the distance, Ish saw a small figure moving. Slamming on the brakes, he realized it was a yellow dog. Clearly a stray, the dog must have lost its owner. Without hesitation, Ish brought the dog into the car and gave it a lucky name. Together, man and dog drove to the city's largest library, where Ish picked out a pile of books to take home. Returning to his own house, Ish decided that without a clear goal, he would stay put for the time being. Perhaps this was the best way to survive in a world that had ended. Ish even imagined spending the rest of his life with his dog, on the condition that whoever outlived the other wouldn't eat their companion. Time passed, and a year slipped by unnoticed. Ish settled into a routine, monotonous but meaningful. The supermarket's food supply seemed endless as long as he consumed it before it expired, and his main focus was maintaining his health. Ish, who had always loved solitude, began to appreciate this quiet life where he could learn freely and enjoy peace at any time. He even started to feel that life wasn't so bad in this post-apocalyptic world. That is, until one day, when something unexpected happened. Ish noticed smoke rising from a house in the distance. For the first time in a year, he had found another survivor who was possibly a girl. Without hesitation, he drove through the deserted streets until he finally reached a house that looked occupied. The scene shifts to a woman holding a rifle appearing on the roof. Ish quickly explained that it had been a long time since he'd seen another human being. He was only here to see if anyone was still alive. The woman, sharing his feelings of isolation, lowered her weapon and invited him inside. Her name was Emma. Her father had been a soldier, and she grew up hunting in the mountains, which allowed her to survive the virus outbreak. For the past year, she had been wandering from place to place and had only recently settled in this house. After sharing some smoked meat and a cup of tea, Ish felt satisfied and told Emma it was time for him to leave. But to his surprise, Emma invited him to stay. She explained that she had chosen this house because there were no bodies inside, though she didn't intend to stay long. This place didn't feel like home. Emma suggested visiting Ish's place, and the next morning, Ish took her to his mountain villa. He hadn't expected to meet someone so outgoing and proactive in this desolate world. When they arrived, Emma was thrilled to see that there was also a large courtyard behind the house. She decided to stay for a while. Hearing this, Ish felt a wave of joy and quickly removed the rope hanging from the beams because he wouldn't be needing it anymore. After discovering that the food in his pantry had been spoiled by mice, they headed to the town's supermarket. The disaster had come so suddenly that the residents hadn't had time to stockpile supplies. The shelves were still packed with goods, and Emma even found a few solar panels. She excitedly declared that this supermarket seemed to be built for surviving the apocalypse. Ish had considered moving there before, but found his villa far more comfortable, especially since there was no one else to compete for resources. They loaded the car with supplies, enough to last them several weeks. Emma, however, wasn't fond of canned food, claiming that the best flavors came from nature. Ish understood her point, but was internally resistant to hunting animals. He believed that this catastrophe was Earth's way of resetting itself, trying to rid itself of humanity, which he saw as a virus. If they continued to defy nature, they would only suffer more punishment. Yet, to satisfy Emma's cravings, Ish reluctantly fetched a fishing rod and caught a few fresh fish from the river. Meanwhile, Emma ventured into the forest to gather wild mushrooms and berries. She even started cultivating a vegetable patch in the backyard. For the first time, Ish realized he was no longer alone, so he began building a chicken coop. According to the books he'd read, if the coop was comfortable enough, chickens would come on their own. Emma mused that this was true rural living. She couldn't help but wonder why everyone else had disappeared while only the two of them remained. Perhaps it was fate, or maybe it was Earth's twisted sense of humor. Touched by her words, Ish felt that they were finally coming together. That night, after a busy day, the two stood wrapped in blankets on the terrace. Ish began thinking about the future. If they were going to stay here long-term, they would need to solve the electricity problem. Light and warmth were essential for a better life. He planned another trip to the supermarket, but his old car, which had been his companion for years, finally broke down. Fortunately, abandoned cars were everywhere and gasoline was plentiful. Ish transported all the solar panels from the supermarket back to his villa, but while installing them, he accidentally fell off the roof. Luckily, Emma was there to help, proving herself to be a skilled and dependable partner. Emma told him that love meant having someone who would wholeheartedly support you when you needed it most. She cherished the feeling of being surrounded by love. Perhaps reminiscing about her past, Emma quietly pulled out a backpack one night. Inside were cherished photos, some of her with her boyfriend, others of her 2 children, and a few with her parents. Sadly, all of them were gone now. The next day, Ish's leg injury had healed, and he prepared to continue installing the solar panels. But Emma dropped a bombshell. She was pregnant. Ish was supposed to feel happy, but instead his brow furrowed with worry. Without hospitals or doctors, he was terrified the child might not survive. Emma comforted him, saying he had to believe that the future would be better. The next moment, Ish, as if injected with a surge of energy, rushed to the library with his dog. The shelves were packed with books on postnatal care for babies. Without a doctor to help, everything would have to rely on his own efforts. Just then, a mouse scurried out, and Ish muttered to himself that the mice were getting bolder these days. Afterward, he went to the supermarket to stock up on baby supplies. Emma found his efforts amusing, remarking that no father could ever be fully prepared before the baby's arrival. She glanced out the window with a smile, noticing that the chicken coop Ish had built was actually working. As time passed, Emma's belly grew larger, and she often felt her legs losing strength. Ish, after poring over numerous books, concluded that Emma needed more legumes and vegetables in her diet. To his surprise, Emma suddenly declared she wanted to eat meat, complaining that it had been far too long since she'd had any. Before Ish could respond, she grabbed her hunting rifle. There was no way Ish would let a pregnant woman go hunting, so he took on the responsibility himself. Near the riverbank, he came across a few wandering livestock. He loaded a bullet into the rifle chamber but hesitated, deciding instead to try herding a cow back home. The animals, however, were not cooperative and scattered in all directions, except for one smaller cow that stood frozen in place. Ish stood there for a long time, conflicted, before finally raising the rifle and pulling the trigger through gritted teeth. The cow didn't die immediately but collapsed to the ground, wailing pitifully. Cursing under his breath, Ish reluctantly fired another shot to end its suffering. With the cow finally dead, he felt no relief, knowing that the real challenge, field dressing it, was about to begin. Following the instructions in a book, Ish angrily grumbled as he gutted and butchered the cow. By the end, he had a full box of beef to show for his efforts. Seeing Emma laughing so hard that she nearly fell over made it all worth it. What neither of them realized, however, was that this beef would bring them an unforeseen crisis. Ish spent another afternoon installing the solar panels, and by evening, the lights flickered on. For the first time, their large refrigerator came to life. Emma pulled out a small cardboard box, explaining that she'd found a drowned rat in the bathroom. Ish didn't think much of it until strange squeaking sounds echoed from the street. Looking through the window, they immediately realized that the smell of slaughtered beef had attracted hungry rats from the surrounding area. They hurried to build a bonfire at the entrance, tossing the leftover beef and extra food into the flames. Unfortunately, it was already too late. Waves of rats were converging on their house. They retreated inside, sealing every door and window tightly. The rats couldn't get in and began pounding against the glass panes. Emma, worried they might infiltrate through the plumbing, poured disinfectant into every pipe and drain. The sound of tiny footsteps echoed from the roof, and Ish could only pray that the rats would leave soon. Then came a whimpering sound from outside the door. Ish's dog had been left outside. Gritting his teeth, Ish ripped the tape off the glass door and told Emma to stand back. With one swift move, he flung the door open, grabbed the dog, and dashed back inside. Though his actions were smooth, they still let a swarm of rats into the house. Ish quickly grabbed his rifle, and when the bullets ran out, he swung a wooden stick at the invaders. After hours of battling, he finally managed to eliminate the intruders inside, but the rats outside showed no signs of dispersing. The poor dog was covered in wounds. Emma administered an antiviral shot and carefully stitched up the injuries. The incident dealt a heavy blow to Ish's confidence. Thinking about his parents' tragic deaths, he couldn't help but worry whether Emma would be able to give birth safely. Emma reassured him, reminding him that she had already given birth to 2 children before. Sadly, her entire family had perished during the outbreak. Though it felt like a lifetime ago, the memories were still fresh in her mind. This time, it was Ish who comforted her. 2 years had passed since the virus outbreak. Wild animals had grown increasingly bold, but a natural ecosystem seemed to have re-established itself. One day, Ish cautiously stepped outside and found that the rat swarm had vanished without a trace. That same day, Emma brought wonderful news. Their baby was about to arrive. The anticipation of becoming a father made Ish incredibly nervous. Despite all the knowledge he had gained from books, he felt completely inexperienced when the moment arrived. Fortunately, Emma's prior experience and calm instructions guided him. Finally, a healthy baby girl was born. Overwhelmed with emotion, Ish marveled at the miracle of life and began to dream of rebuilding human civilization. Ish was no longer a carefree loner living only for himself. With the joys of family came newfound responsibilities. But Emma wasn't one to settle. She painted their family's address on a prominent wall in town, declaring that survivors still lived there. Yet, in the 6 years that followed, only one couple came seeking refuge, a testament to how devastating the virus had been to humanity. Meanwhile, the Ish family had brought 2 children into the world, and Emma was pregnant with their third. Their contribution to humanity's survival was nothing short of extraordinary. One day, Ish was picking fruit in the mountains when he accidentally hit a lion with his vehicle on the way home. Realizing the lion wasn't quite dead, he considered putting it out of its misery, but just as he raised his gun, a shadow darted through the trees. Startled, Ish quickly gave chase, not having seen another human being in years. To his surprise, the figure turned out to be a young girl carrying a backpack. Ish, realizing his actions had frightened her, quickly lowered his gun and tried to explain that he meant no harm. He offered her some fresh fruit from the car, but she ran off in fear. Sighing, Ish returned to his vehicle, only to find that the lion's body had vanished. He guessed that there might be other survivors nearby. Just as he was about to drive away, the girl reappeared. Ish pulled out an apple and casually tossed it to her. As she devoured it hungrily, he told her there was plenty more at his place. Hesitant but tempted, the girl eventually climbed into the car. Back home, Ish introduced her to his family, his wife, Emma, their 2 children, a boy and a girl, and their pet dog. The girl remained silent, her eyes vacant and devoid of emotion. Concerned, Ish consulted their neighbors, George and Maureen. They speculated that the girl had been traumatized, but Ish wasn't convinced. He thought of the missing animal carcasses and suspected her family might be nearby. Regret gnawed at him for bringing the girl home. Maureen tried approaching the girl, but her attempts triggered an intense reaction. That's when Maureen noticed scars covering the girl's arms, marks of someone who had fought off the virus using her own immunity. This shared experience seemed to resonate with the girl, and she began to relax around Maureen. Encouraged, Maureen led the girl, whom they learned was named Evie, to clean up and settle in. While Evie was washing up, Maureen couldn't resist peeking into her backpack. Inside, she found a sketchbook filled with eerie, unsettling drawings. Hidden in the lining was a letter. Just as she was about to read it, Evie appeared in the doorway, her expression cold and haunting. Maureen quickly hid her curiosity behind a warm smile and encouraged Evie to get some rest. Later, Ish and George returned from the forest, reporting that they had found evidence of human habitation nearby. Ish suggested they couldn't keep Evie with them, but Maureen produced the letter from Evie's backpack. It was written by Evie's mother, who explained that her daughter had developed severe social anxiety and selective mutism due to abuse from her father. Her mother had tried to help but contracted the virus. In the letter, she expressed her hope that even after her passing, Evie could find happiness and live a good life. The room fell into a heavy silence. Emma, moved by compassion, decided they would take Evie in. Days passed, and Ish welcomed his third child into the world. Although he was no longer a first-time father, his tenderness and joy were undiminished. He resolved to protect his children from the hardships he had endured and to ensure they grew up healthy and strong, even in a world as unforgiving as this. Perhaps this was the universal wish of all parents, just like Evie's mother, who had sacrificed so much for her daughter's future. Watching their children grow brought immense happiness to everyone, including George and Emma, who felt their burdens lighten despite the apocalyptic world they inhabited. One day, their peace was shattered when the alarm outside their yard blared. George spotted shadows moving in the woods, his unease growing. They hid the children in a secure room, and the adults armed themselves as they ventured out to investigate. In a lawless world, vigilance was paramount. Ish speculated that Evie's family had come looking for her. Just as they split up to search, Emma spotted a figure and prepared to fire, only to see another stranger step out of the shadows. Before tensions could escalate, a man and woman shouted, insisting it was all a misunderstanding. They were only searching for their child. Ish remained skeptical, unsure if they were lying, until a young boy emerged from the forest. With that, the misunderstanding was resolved. Emma invited the trio, a man, a woman, and a boy, into their home. After confirming they had no connection to Evie, George finally relaxed. The newcomers revealed that they were from Oregon and had been wandering for survival, constantly on the move. They had seen Emma's address and decided to take a chance on finding other survivors. The woman, Molly, introduced herself as a doctor. She recounted how all of her patients had succumbed to the virus during the outbreak. Left with no choice, she had fled south, finding no survivors along the way except for Jean and her family. When Maureen turned and saw the woman behind her, she suddenly realized it was none other than the famous singer, Jean. Maureen had even collected several of her records. The distance between them instantly seemed to shrink. Emma warmly invited them to stay the night, but Ish, still wary, was about to refuse when Maureen stepped in and volunteered to arrange rooms for the three newcomers. Ish was at a loss for words. 7 years had passed, and the signpost marking their address still stood, but he felt they couldn't just open their doors to everyone. Emma, with a knowing smile, asked if Maureen and George were not good neighbors, and if the little boy would not be a perfect playmate for our children. While Emma's reasoning made sense, Ish still felt uneasy about letting these strangers stay. Emma simply smiled again and said she wanted to build a new world for their children. They needed bridges, not walls. The next morning, Ish gathered everyone together. He explained that gathering resources was an essential survival skill, and the group was split into pairs to head out and search specific areas for supplies. Ish repeatedly warned everyone to be cautious of wild animals. Dr. Molly asked why they weren't searching for medical supplies. Ish explained that most had been scavenged years ago. The group hadn't been on the road long when they encountered a bison blocking the way. They had no choice but to park the car and continue on foot to a nearby store. Inside, most of the shelves were bare, save for a few dusty canned goods. Ish reminded himself how lucky they were to have his vegetable garden, fruit trees, and livestock. Without them, they might have starved long ago. By the time the sun was setting, everyone returned with their finds. Among the haul were 10 bottles of drinks, and Jean's husband had even found a guitar for Jean. However, it was soon discovered that Molly had gone missing. It turned out that Molly hadn't followed Ish's instructions. Instead, she had ventured off to a hospital on her own, searching for medical supplies. Inside the desolate building, she found nothing but dried-up corpses and useless debris. Just as she was about to leave, a wolf leapt out at her. Terrified, Molly grabbed a fire extinguisher from the wall and managed to scare it off. That's when she noticed a locked room. After breaking in, she found it stocked with precious medical supplies. Molly rejoined the group with excitement, but Ish was visibly upset. Her reckless behavior had put everyone at risk. The group had just been discussing how to organize a search for her. Back at the mountain villa, the group gathered around a fire to celebrate their successful day. The husband's guitar found its purpose as Jean performed an impromptu concert, her beautiful voice lifting everyone's spirits. The husband, ever the life of the party, kept the atmosphere lively. As laughter and music filled the air, even Ish's ever-present vigilance began to fade. But behind the smiles and camaraderie, who could truly understand the loneliness and sorrow each of them carried in their hearts? The next morning, George approached Ish with a sly grin. He announced that Maureen was pregnant and expressed his gratitude for being part of their big family. As a token of thanks, he presented Ish with a hammer, a sturdy tool perfect for mining. Ish chuckled and shook his head, saying with a wry smile that he almost forgot he used to be a geologist. 14 years had passed since the outbreak of the virus. The once young puppy was now old and frail, and Ish found he no longer needed its constant companionship. Aside from sharing meals with friends and neighbors, Ish often took his children to the library, a place he cherished and saw as the best way for the kids to learn about the world that once was. One day, as a storm raged outside, Ish hurried his children home through the rain. Once inside, he did a head count. His wife and children were all present, but something felt amiss. He soon realized his dog was missing. A sense of dread filled his heart as he braved the storm to search the yard. Finally, under a fallen tree, he found the dog's lifeless body. Letting out a guttural cry of grief, Ish mourned his loyal companion of 14 years. The dog had been his first friend in the apocalypse. George tried to console him, reminding Ish that although the dog was gone, he still had family and friends by his side. Taking George's words to heart, Ish decided to check on his youngest son. But as he approached, a lion suddenly emerged from the bushes. Without hesitation, Ish leapt in front of his son, shielding him with his own body. The lion pounced, knocking him to the ground. Grabbing the hammer George had given him, Ish swung wildly, but his body was soon soaked in blood. In the chaos, Evie finally broke her silence and screamed for help. Thankfully, Evie's frantic cries for help summoned the others, who managed to rescue Ish from the beast's jaws. Gravely injured, with wounds so severe that blood poured from him like a fountain, Ish's survival seemed impossible. Fortunately, they now had a skilled surgeon among them. Through a grueling night of emergency surgery, Dr. Molly managed to stabilize Ish's condition. Unable to help, Emma sat anxiously by his side. Determined to do something for her husband, she grabbed a rifle and ventured into the forest alone. A hunter by trade, Emma carefully followed the tracks left behind by the lion. She eventually found the creature and, with steady hands, aimed her gun. Without hesitation, she pulled the trigger. Thankfully, it wasn't long before Ish finally regained consciousness. Dr. Molly exclaimed in disbelief, calling it a miracle. She had never seen anyone survive such a vicious animal attack. Ever modest, Ish brushed off the praise, saying he had just been lying in bed while Molly had done all the hard work. Molly hesitated before revealing a secret she had kept hidden for years. The truth was, she had dropped out of medical school after less than 2 years. When the apocalypse struck, all the doctors she had known perished. To survive, Molly crafted a lie, pretending to be a doctor so she could bask in the trust and respect of her companions. However, when she found herself treating Ish on the brink of death the day before, she realized that her lie might have endangered lives. Ish listened carefully and shook his head, saying with conviction that she already surpassed the person she once thought she was. A few days later, Ish was able to get out of bed, filling his family with joy. Despite the hardships of post-apocalyptic life, they were not alone. Time passed quickly, and 3 years later, Ish's youngest son, Joey, was old enough to head out to sea and fish. His second son, however, spent every day stationed at the watchtower, keeping an eye on their surroundings. Meanwhile, his eldest daughter, Heather, had grown restless, spending most of her time with Jean's son. Born into the apocalypse, both teenagers were endlessly fascinated by relics of the pre-disaster world. Heather's greatest wish was to explore the world beyond their community. Her boyfriend wholeheartedly supported her dream, and that very night, Heather confided her wish to her open-minded mother. As expected, Ish initially refused outright. He even regretted introducing the children to books, as the stories had filled their heads with dreams of the outside world. He reminded Heather that humans were far more dangerous than the wild animals that roamed freely. But Emma dismissed his fears, pointing out that their family wouldn't even exist if she hadn't once ventured far and wide herself, and that the meaning of life lies in exploring the unknown. Her words finally convinced the stubborn Ish. The next morning, Ish packed their vehicle with supplies while Emma handed Heather her prized rifle. Though she fully supported her daughter's journey, Emma, like most mothers, couldn't hide her sadness during their farewell. Both families reluctantly waved goodbye, watching the car disappear into the distance, unsure when or if they would meet again. Later that day, Evie was cooking in the kitchen when she discovered the water had stopped running. This was the first time such a thing had happened since the disaster struck. Alarmed, Ish and a group of neighbors rushed to the reservoir, only to find that the aging water pipes had corroded beyond repair. To make matters worse, the recent drought had nearly drained the dam. Ish realized they were now facing a water crisis. As they discussed their options, two vehicles suddenly appeared on the highway above them. Ish's heart sank. Ignoring the calls from behind him, he grabbed his son and rushed to their car, heading back to the community without a moment's hesitation. He feared they might have been followed. Back at the villa, Ish told the women to take the children and hide in the rooms. George pointed out that if the strangers were determined, they could easily follow the tire tracks right to them. No sooner had he spoken than the sound of engines roared from outside. The strangers had indeed followed them. Ish cautiously approached and noticed the visitors didn't appear hostile. One of them even offered him a jug of fresh water. After tasting it and confirming it was safe, Ish slowly lowered his guard. The man introduced himself as Charlie and explained that they carried professional drilling equipment and could help Ish dig a well for fresh water. Emma was overjoyed, exclaiming how wonderful it was to meet new friends. Moments later, the two groups were seated at the dining table, laughing and chatting. Ish repeatedly emphasized the difficulty of drilling a well in the rocky terrain. Charlie confidently replied that even with their hammer drill and compressors running non-stop, it would take at least 3 days to finish. In return, Ish would need to provide sufficient food and fuel as payment. With a toast, the two groups celebrated and finalized their deal. Wasting no time, Charlie and his team began work after dinner. While setting up the drill, Charlie suggested going hunting to bring back some fresh game for dinner. In the forest, they soon spotted a deer. Just as Ish was preparing to take aim, Charlie suddenly fired without warning, startling Ish. Watching Charlie's casual demeanor, Ish couldn't help but wonder if the man had pointed his gun at humans just as easily as he did at animals. That night, during dinner, someone noticed scars scattered across Charlie's body. When asked about them, Charlie gave vague answers and avoided eye contact, his gaze occasionally drifting toward Evie. This only deepened Ish's suspicions about the man. After the meal, Ish decided to probe further, asking Charlie how he had survived for so long. Charlie replied that there were only two kinds of people in this world, the strong and the weak. Only strong people who figure out how to adapt can thrive in the apocalypse. Sensing the arrogance in Charlie's words, Ish quickly shared his own perspective. He explained how he had read countless books in the library, learning survival skills to prepare for crises. He assured Charlie that even without his help, he would have found a way to provide fresh water for everyone. Charlie didn't seem to doubt him. Instead, he suddenly said he liked him before turning to leave. Ish shuddered as he watched him walk away. The next morning, during breakfast, Ish's second son declared that he no longer wanted to stand watch at the tower. Instead, he wanted to help with the well drilling in the backyard. Ish immediately voiced his distrust of Charlie and warned his son to stay away from him and his crew. This time, however, his son didn't back down. He insisted on doing what he enjoyed, though he couldn't help but feel some unspoken anger brewing within him. Thankfully, Emma stepped in to mediate. She reminded Ish how cautious he had been with Molly and her group at first, only for them to end up saving his life. Ish, however, was convinced his instincts were correct. He pointed out Charlie's lingering stares at Evie and how Charlie had told him he liked him the night before. Emma was speechless, dismissing Ish's concerns as overly sensitive. At that moment, Charlie brought some troubling news. Their drill was down to its last bit. If it broke or failed to hit water, the entire well drilling operation would come to a halt. Ish stared silently at the machine, feeling as though Charlie was setting some kind of trap for him. What unsettled him even more was seeing Charlie's crew bond easily with his children and neighbors. Ish couldn't shake the strange feeling of being isolated from his own community. Almost as if guided by instinct, he wandered off into the woods, recalling something he had read in a book about how walking in the forest could clear one's mind. Ish desperately needed clarity. Before he knew it, the stars were lighting up the night sky. Meanwhile, singer Jean happened to run into Charlie outside. Charlie struck up a conversation, revealing that he was one of her fans. He even recalled a specific concert where Jean had raised a flask of rainwater in a toast to her audience. Reliving her past glory brought a soft, alluring smile to Jean's face. Seizing the moment, Charlie suggested they get to know each other better, but Jean instinctively declined, saying she needed to return to her husband and children. Before parting ways, Charlie left her with a sly remark that if she changed her mind, she knew where to find him. Around the same time, Ish returned to his villa. Emma noticed the earthy smell clinging to him and scolded him for wandering into the woods alone, a rule Ish himself had set. He quickly admitted his mistake, but shared that his walk had been fruitful, helping him rediscover his sense of self. Emma, however, was worried about what they would do if the well didn't produce water. Ish reassured her, saying he was already thinking about what to do next, after the well situation was resolved. The next morning, a crowd gathered around the drilling equipment. Charlie gestured for everyone to stay quiet, and soon they heard bubbling sounds rising from deep underground. Moments later, a gush of clear water shot into the air. The well was a success. Cheers erupted as everyone clapped and celebrated. But Ish stood frozen in place, watching the scene in silence. After some time, he approached Charlie and told him to pack his things and leave. To his surprise, Charlie, riding high on the success of the water well, declared that he had decided to stay and live there permanently. That night, the survivors gathered for a celebration, singing and dancing to mark the resolution of the water crisis. Naturally, Charlie was the center of attention, hailed as the hero of the hour. But Ish sat sullenly on the sidelines, deeply worried that the community he had worked so hard to build might crumble under Charlie's influence. Perhaps emboldened by the festivities, Charlie revealed his true colors that same night. He was seen leaving Evie's room, adjusting his smelly pants. Ish, who had witnessed the scene, rushed into the room to find Evie sobbing quietly. Meanwhile, Charlie strolled back to his RV as if nothing had happened. His wife, seemingly accustomed to his vile behavior, said nothing and stormed off in anger. Evie, still trembling, sat at the table while Ish and the others paced the room in frustration. The damage had already been done, but they knew they had to act to prevent further harm. Ish had long suspected that Charlie was a predator who took pleasure in exploiting the weak. Emma, filled with regret, insisted that Charlie and his group must be expelled from their community. Ish shook his head, explaining that Charlie was like a wild beast. If driven away, he would undoubtedly return for revenge. Molly wondered aloud if they should build a prison to contain him. But Emma, showing rare resolve, declared that they had to kill Charlie. Ish was the first to voice his support. However, some members of the group, sheltered by the relative safety of the community, argued against taking a life. One person even suggested holding a vote on the matter. Emma was exasperated, saying now was not the time for law and order. Singer Jean finally spoke up. She admitted that after her brief interaction with Charlie the previous day, she saw him for what he truly was, a defiant and untamed wolf. The only way to deal with someone like him was to strike him down decisively. Her husband naturally stood by her side. However, their neighbor George was hesitant. He had shared drinks with Charlie before, and they were on the best terms among the group. Fortunately, George's wife, Maureen, managed to reason with him and persuade him to agree. With a mix of persuasion and pressure, the group finally reached a unanimous decision. Moments later, Ish grabbed a hammer and knocked on the door of Charlie's RV. Charlie, already expecting a confrontation, opened the door with a smug confidence. Relying on his reputation and the sway he held over the group, he wasn't the least bit intimidated. He even threatened Ish, saying if he dared lay a hand on him, he would make sure Ish's wife and kids were his. In this world, the strong take everything, and the weak are left buried in the dirt. Ish didn't respond. His gaze was calm, almost pitying. The next moment, Emma, George, and several neighbors emerged from the shadows. Charlie's expression darkened. He hadn't expected the same people who had been grateful to him earlier that day to now stand united against him. Ish didn't give Charlie a chance to argue. He swung the hammer down without hesitation and kept striking. As he worked, he muttered that they had to do this. It was Ish's first time killing someone, and he became fixated on erasing every trace of what he had done. Emma tried to comfort her husband, reminding him that his actions were to save others. Yet Ish couldn't escape the haunting weight of his guilt. He continued scrubbing away the bloodstains until dawn. When his youngest son, Joey, sleepily wandered by, Ish forced a smile and led him away from the bathroom, leaving behind the cold, bloodied hammer. But the ordeal wasn't over. Everyone in the community remained tense, their fists clenched in anticipation of retaliation. Charlie's crew still had significant numbers, and there was a real risk of a major conflict. The group decided to start by confronting Charlie's wife. When she woke, Molly bluntly told her that Charlie was dead, explaining that his barbaric behavior was inexcusable. To their surprise, after a brief moment of shock, Charlie's wife accepted the news calmly. It turned out she had long harbored deep hatred for him. With her cooperation, the rest became easier. When Charlie's remaining crew stepped out of their bus, Ish and the others were already in position, armed and stationed at strategic vantage points. They had the upper hand, leaving no chance for resistance. Ish issued a harsh ultimatum. They either sever ties with Charlie and live here peacefully, or pack up and leave immediately. Most of the group chose to side with Ish, revealing that they also had grown weary of Charlie's tyrannical ways. Only one henchman of Charlie's refused to comply. He had been Charlie's lookout for his misdeeds and was complicit in his actions. Ish refused to allow someone like that to stay in the community. As the henchman left alone, the community breathed a collective sigh of relief. But their relief was short-lived. Not long after the gates closed, he returned, pleading for another chance. After some thought, he admitted that he wouldn't survive in the harsh world outside and offered Ish his knife as a gesture of goodwill. Ish hesitated for a few moments before firmly rejecting him, handing the knife back and turning away without looking back. 3 years passed in the blink of an eye. The wilderness around the community had become even more vibrant with life, and the children of the settlement were growing up fast. Joey, now older, climbed to the top of a tall tree and marveled at the beauty of the landscape spread out below. He relished the feeling of looking down on the world. 2 weeks later, Ish stood proudly before the community, announcing that Joey had completed an extraordinary project. With a smile, he pulled back a wooden curtain to reveal a simple yet functional flying machine. The solar-powered craft, capable of flying up to 200 miles, had been Joey's idea and was built with the help of the neighborhood's skilled hands. Ish was beaming with pride, declaring that every child in this community was a part of its future, and Joey can create the future. The group gathered in the courtyard to celebrate Joey's success with a feast, but amid the revelry, no one noticed the pallor on Joey's face. Later that night, as Ish was reading him a bedtime story, Joey confided that he felt unusually cold. Ish dismissed it as a simple cold, but his worst fears were realized when Joey collapsed in the doorway of his bedroom in the middle of the night. When Dr. Molly came to examine him, she delivered devastating news. Joey had contracted the doomsday virus. Ish hadn't experienced the early stages of the outbreak firsthand. He had gone to bed one night and woken up to find the world in ruins. But Molly had witnessed the virus's horrors. Infected individuals suffered severe fevers and loss of consciousness, and within 2 or 3 days, organ failure led to death. The virus was incredibly contagious, with no cure or vaccine. Molly urged Ish to take every precaution, but Ish was single-minded. He only cared about finding a way to save his son. Unfortunately, the nightmare continued. A second case of infection was soon reported in the community. Emma quickly enlisted Maureen and Evie's help, as both women had survived prior infections and carried natural antibodies. Despite their efforts, the virus spread rapidly. In less than half a day, 4 survivors had fallen ill. The terrifying virulence of the virus became undeniable. At this moment, Joey's fever showed no signs of subsiding. Ish stayed by his side, constantly trying to bring the temperature down with cold compresses. The little boy worried he might never get the chance to ride the flying machine. Ish, suppressing his grief, tucked his son in gently. By chance, as he turned his head, he thought he saw Charlie's face, the man he had killed. His heart jolted. He thought this might be the price of taking Charlie's life. Lost in doubt and unease, Ish eventually drifted into a restless sleep. The next morning, Ish woke to the sight of his wife Emma beaming as she opened the door. Their eldest daughter Heather had returned from her travels. However, her joy was bittersweet. Her boyfriend, who had accompanied her, had tragically passed away. This journey seemed to have matured Heather significantly. She now truly appreciated the irreplaceable value of family and vowed never to leave home again. Lying down beside her younger brother, she prayed sincerely for his recovery. Ish, unwilling to sit idly by, drove his pickup truck at breakneck speed to the city's exit bridge. The road to the neighboring city was blocked, with only enough space for a bicycle to pass. The pharmacies in Ish's city had long been emptied of supplies, so he decided to try his luck in the neighboring city. Though it too had fallen, Ish pressed on and reached the nearest hospital. Breaking into the pharmacy, he was greeted by shelves filled with various medications. He knew these wouldn't do much for Joey's condition, but he felt he had to try, just as his wife once risked her life hunting in the forest when he was mauled by a wild lion. With a bag full of antiviral drugs slung over his shoulder, Ish prepared to leave when he noticed a prayer room by the hallway. Hesitating for a moment, he stepped inside. Ish had reached the end of his rope. He knelt down and prayed, hoping some divine power might hear his pleas. If killing Charlie truly required a price to be paid, Ish was willing to offer his own life in exchange for his son's survival. Without Joey and his family, Ish doubted he could go on living. For the first time, he began to reflect on why he had fought so hard to survive until now. With the apocalypse virus returning after 20 years, the few remaining survivors were pushed to the brink of collapse. Watching Joey grow weaker each day broke Ish's heart. Determined to save his son, Ish ventured to the neighboring city and returned with not just antiviral drugs, but also several blood transfusion kits. His plan was to transfer blood containing antibodies to Joey. Though the chances of success were slim, Ish didn't care. Even the smallest hope was worth pursuing. Dr. Molly brought good news. Heather had returned with a decent amount of Pacific yew leaves, known for their medicinal properties. However, Ish still felt it wasn't enough. Desperate, he carried Joey in his arms and sought help from their neighbor George, one of the most devout believers among the survivors. For Joey, Ish was willing to try anything, even prayer. Joey's body, immersed in icy water, felt some relief from the heat. Weakly, he asked his father if he was flying. Smiling through his pain, Ish reassured him that he had always been flying. Meanwhile, Heather sat solemnly before Jean and her husband. Their son had accompanied Heather on her journey but did not return. Heather knew she owed them an explanation. She recounted their travels. At first, they were filled with excitement and hope as they journeyed eastward. They passed lush forests and stunning beaches, but over time, the thrill wore off. They realized the world beyond their community was no different. Every town they visited was eerily empty, devoid of life. One day, they noticed a series of numbers and arrows painted on a wall. Though they didn't understand the numbers, it was clear they had been left by other survivors. Following the arrows, they eventually arrived at the coast, only to find the trail ended there. Disheartened, the two decided to return home the next morning. While exploring a cliff, Heather discovered a Pacific yew tree. Remembering her father's stories about its healing properties, she decided to gather some leaves. On her way back to their campsite, a bearded man suddenly appeared. Alarmed, Heather rushed back to her boyfriend and urged him to pack quickly so they could leave. But the man followed them, eventually taking her boyfriend hostage. Heather begged for their lives, offering all their food in exchange. When the man seemed momentarily distracted, her boyfriend attempted to escape but was stabbed in the stomach. Enraged, Heather hurled her axe, killing the man instantly. Despite her best efforts, her boyfriend succumbed to his injuries. Stricken with grief, Heather buried him near the coastline. On her journey back home, her car broke down, forcing her to walk for weeks until she finally returned. Hearing Heather's story, Jean and her husband broke down in tears, mourning the loss of their son. But as heartbreaking as it was, life had to go on. Early the next morning, Dr. Molly brought some exciting news. After 20 years of mutation, the apocalyptic virus had weakened significantly. With the addition of the yew tree leaves Heather had brought back, most of the infected in the community had a good chance of recovering. Heather stepped out of the quarantine trailer and ran into a survivor who had once been a teammate of Charlie. After Charlie's death, he was the first to pledge allegiance to Ish. Last night, he had heard about Heather's boyfriend's death and was curious about the killer's other traits. Heather recalled that aside from a full beard, the man also had a golden tattoo on his arm. The man's expression changed instantly. He recognized this description all too well. It matched the henchman who had been expelled from the community by Ish. He couldn't believe how coincidental this was, and his mind was immediately filled with turmoil. Just then, Dr. Molly happened to pass by. He quickly asked if he should reveal a secret he wasn't sure about sharing. Molly advised him that if the secret didn't make the world a better place, it was better left unsaid. The man nodded, understanding. Now that the killer was dead, revealing his identity seemed meaningless. He decided to keep the secret buried deep within himself. Meanwhile, Ish was still sitting at his son's bedside, feeling as if time had stopped. His son showed no signs of improvement all night, but now, suddenly, he spoke. He wanted to know where he would go after death and how he could meet his father again. Ish's heart sank as he gripped his son's hand. But before he could respond, Joey unexpectedly closed his eyes and silently slipped away forever. Although Ish had mentally prepared himself, his heart still couldn't accept the reality. He ran to the town street and erased the family address his wife had left behind. Ish had lost all hope for the future. Next, he headed to the library, the place Joey had loved. Now he felt it had no purpose and wanted to burn it down. Just then, Emma stepped out and asked if his world was only about Joey. She told him not to forget about his other 2 children and the neighbor's kids. They are still the hope for the world's future. Ish stood still for a long time, letting the match in his hand go out. As the sun set, he returned home, absent-minded. Emma was also grieving deeply, but she seemed far more enlightened. She said, "Life is full of separations, and the most important thing is to cherish the present." It was then that Ish realized his wife's heart hurt just as much as his. After all, when the disaster first struck, she had lost both her parents and her child. It was hard for him to imagine how she had managed to keep going. The next morning, Ish climbed to the top of the mountain, took a deep breath of fresh air, and looked at the sky painted by the sunrise. He felt inexplicably at peace, especially as a large flock of birds flew past. His eyes welled up. After 20 years of catastrophe, Earth was finally showing signs of life again. Ish buried the grief of losing his son as deeply as he could and threw himself back into the noble work of education. The world today was completely different from the one he had known. No environmental pollution or human-caused destruction. Everywhere he looked, there was green grass and blue skies. Ish believed that the knowledge of the past was no longer suited for this world, and the best way to educate children now was to let them connect with nature and learn how to live in harmony with the earth. A year later, Ish had moved past the pain of losing Joey. While sorting through his son's room, he came across a notebook. It turned out that Joey, in addition to building planes, had been planning to assemble a radio. Though he was young, Joey had a stronger desire to explore the world than anyone else. He believed there had to be more survivors beyond their community, and building the plane was just a way to find them. But this method was too slow. Only a radio could break the communication barrier between them. Ish couldn't help but marvel at his son's brilliant idea. The world was vast, and their community was still too small. He decided to fulfill the dream his son couldn't finish. The plan was immediately supported by all the neighbors. After much effort, they finally built a perfect radio. But Ish was somewhat disappointed. No matter what frequency he tried, he couldn't get any response from other survivors. His wife urged him to take a break. It was a job that couldn't be completed in a day. The community was holding a large baseball match. Watching the kids' teams challenge the adults, Ish couldn't help but feel a bit emotional. When the apocalypse came, he thought he would die alone, but more and more people were gathering around. Still, it wasn't enough. Children needed a better environment to grow. He talked to Heather about numbers, and she casually mentioned a strange sequence of numbers she had seen during her last outing. She still hadn't figured out what they meant. Upon hearing this, Ish had a sudden realization, thinking those 6 digits could represent a frequency band. He couldn't wait to input it into the radio, and soon the neighbors gathered together. After repeated calls from Ish, a response finally came through on the other end of the line, and the group couldn't help but burst into tears of joy. They had been so lonely for so long, and they were desperately in need of rejoining a larger society. After some questioning, they learned that the people on the other end lived on a nearby island where they made a living by fishing. The island had now grown into a sizable settlement, but soon some raised concerns. What if these people were just as vicious as Charlie's group? The woman on the other end spoke up, revealing that she had shared the same worry when she first wrote down the radio frequency. But now, it seemed that her initial concerns had been justified. Just like how Emma had left the family address all those years ago, as long as most people held kind hearts, there would always be a way to identify and filter out those who were malicious. Ish was silent for a moment before answering on behalf of everyone. They would move to the island together. After all, humans are complex social animals. 50 years after the catastrophe, Ish was now an old man with graying hair. He passed his beloved hammer to Heather's eldest son, believing that some beliefs must be passed on because everyone eventually faces death, but the earth will endure forever. This is Daniel CC Movie Channel. Stay safe and enjoy your day.